as the WWF Sustainable Finance team, we do a lot of work with the banks to help them understand and assess some of the risks posed by climate change and environmental issues. And I think in terms of where the room for improvement lies, as you've noted, many of them are already looking at climate change, and there's been a good improvement from last year in terms of how many banks actually acknowledge climate risk and sustainable finance as material. So we see 80% of banks making that acknowledgement, up from 31% last year. And then as well, last year we saw that just 6% of the ASEAN banks had strategies in place to address climate change. This number has quadrupled to 24%, which is obviously a great improvement. And if you include the Japanese and Korean banks as well, that number is now 35%. But where room for improvement lies is really in terms of taking further steps to address those gaps, notably in terms of introducing policies that prohibit the financing of new coal-fired power plants. Right now, we just have 4 banks out of the 48 that do this without exceptions. And then also on the nature side of things, there is a need for banks to address the risks related to biodiversity loss and nature loss more generally, with just 38% of the banks acknowledging that environmental degradation does pose economic and societal risks. And this is obviously of great concern, given that some $44 trillion of GDP, or just under half, is actually moderately or highly dependent on nature and its ecosystem services.
Keith, good morning. Tanvi joining in this conversation. You're talking about how Japanese banks have performed above average in this survey. Tell us more about that. I mean, in what shape and form do you think Japan is changing the game when it comes to sustainable finance?
Thank you, Tanvir. So the Japanese banks have been focusing on sustainable finance for slightly longer, I would say, than the average bank in Asia. And I think in Japan, there has been a notable focus on implementing the recommendations of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures in particular, which is why you see that they tend to perform better on some of the indicators within our framework that pertain to climate change and climate governance. However, there tends to still be an overall lack of disclosures, in particular around the specific policies that they have for lending to companies in sensitive sectors, and also around the processes by which they are integrating climate-related risks into their overall risk management and decision-making processes. So while they are certainly leading the pack in terms of addressing climate change through a kind of high-level approach in terms of governance and the product offerings that they have, there still could be further transparency around precisely how they're integrating these considerations into their decision-making processes.